Thank you all for being patient. All right, so today I'm talking about the Cold War and especially the second part of that containment and intervention period. Um, we're going to start with our focus on President Kennedy. So this is just a quick overview of some of those things. Hopefully, you already had a chance to read, but I'll be able to maybe embellish a little bit more than the reading had. Okay. And after this is done, I encourage you, or while it's going on, I encourage you to type some questions into the chat space, and I will do my best to try and answer them. And as always, if I don't know the answer to something, I will take the time later and find it out. Okay. Or if you want to, feel free to go ahead and find it out yourself. Google works great for all of us. Okay. Um, so when President Eisenhower was on the way out, he gave this message, his farewell address to the nation, where he talks about the military industrial complex. Okay, so this military industrial complex is the coordination of businesses that make weapons for the military. It is a huge, profitable business. As you know, the United States today spends more money on military and weapons than the next 10 countries in the world behind us. Okay, so you take the next 10 countries, 2 through 11, add them up, and we spend more money than they do on our military and on weapons. Eisenhower warned about that. They said if our military industries become too important, too lucrative of a business, then they will have too much influence on our government, um, because they will be able to command uh, lots of workers. And therefore, with all that workers, that's a lot of money, a lot of votes, and therefore continue to keep paying these businesses to make weapons so that they will continue to get votes. So the military industrial complex was something that President Eisenhower warned about on his way out of presidency. He had already ran his time with 2 terms, and the two competing candidates for president were would be President Kennedy, and then someone who would later be president, which would be Nixon. Now, later, we'll talk about their presidential campaign when we talk about this time period, but at the home front as opposed to foreign affairs. And it was a first for a lot of things, but we'll talk about that later. But President Kennedy will win this election. And President Kennedy wants to kind of change things some, where Eisenhower wanted there to be a drawback of the military and focus on nuclear weapons so that they save money and have this weapon where it's like, come at us, bro, we got you, right? So they had this arms race with the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons, kind of like this image is behind me, right? Um, Kennedy says that is putting too much emphasis on one thing. We need to be flexible. We need to be able to have a varied amount of responses. And so we have what's called flexible response, where he says, I want to invest more money in different types of military. So not just nuclear weapons, but also, more soldiers, tanks, planes, helicopters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the United States had already been involved in Korea, okay, during Eisenhower's presidency, and saw the need for multiple methods of um, attacking, defending, and fighting. Right. So his flexible response was basically a buildup of the military, and a buildup of the military meant that military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about was getting probably what they wanted. Okay. Well, the other things Kennedy did was the Peace Corps. This was an attempt at intervention, an attempt at containment, where he would created this voluntary organization, the United States Peace Corps, and they will go to different countries around the world and just help and just assist other countries, other governments, other people. This was kind of a goodwill method of intervention. Instead of getting involved in fighting enemies, let's make friends by helping them. So it doesn't always have to be about punishment. It could also be about reward. And that's always something important to consider too. There's more than one way to get your goals. But one of the biggest impacts events that happened during Kennedy's presidency with regard to foreign affairs is something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of movies have been made about this. Even one of the X-Men movies, X-Men Origins, I think, goes with this and how the X-Men stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis by themselves. So that was really kind of a twist, but I don't think that was true in real life. I'm not sure about the X-Men, honestly. But basically, Cuba had become a communist nation in 1959, 1960. Fidel Castro takes over, and the premier of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, says, we have a communist ally miles, just a few dozen miles away from the United States. Wouldn't it be great to be able to put nuclear weapons just a few miles from the United States? And so he starts sending ships with supplies to build and put in nuclear weapons in Cuba. The United States says we can't have this. We can't have nuclear weapons so close to the United States that we wouldn't have a chance to respond if they launched them at us. So Kennedy orders a blockade of Cuba, sends the Navy out, surrounds the island basically, and as the Soviet ships are coming, basically dares the Soviet Union to run that blockade. If you run that blockade, we're going to fire upon you, and we will have a world war, basically, because NATO and the Warsaw Pact were two different alliances, peacetime alliances that promised to help anyone that was attacked. So if the United States attacks the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact would get involved, and then therefore NATO would get involved, and we have World War III. All right, so we were at the brink or the edge of a nuclear war. It's probably the closest the United States, the world, has ever come to an all-out nuclear war in the history of the world. Right, so Cuban Missile Crisis was a big deal. You can ask anybody, maybe your parents, more likely your grandparents, if they remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, especially if they lived here in Florida. Really scary when you consider how close Cuba is to Miami. Okay, so Kennedy, there were a number of things. He gets involved in, he's trying to avoid really getting involved in Vietnam. Vietnam was complicated. It had began in the 60s. The French were there. They were trying to support the pro-capitalist government. Communist government will then try and take over. The French are having these problems, and eventually they will leave. The United States steps in because they don't want to see this domino theory happen and have Vietnam fall. Korea has already been split and fell. China had already done it. They don't want to see it Vietnam. So the United States gets involved in an attempt to try and stop the spread of communism. They will, under Kennedy, try and minimize how much they do. They will send what we call a police support. They will defend the capitalist government, but they will not engage in all-out attacks. So they will not fire back. Actually, they will not fire first. They can only fire if fired upon. So they won't shoot first, but if they get shot at, they'll shoot back. Okay, so the United States gets a little bit involved, but Kennedy doesn't really want it to be an all-out war. They know that this is a proxy war. Remember, it's really communism and the other countries that support it, and capitalism and the countries that support that, fighting using the people in Vietnam. Here's what your kids need right now. So they wanted to make sure that he didn't get too far involved. Well, Kennedy gets assassinated just 2.5 years into his presidency. The next president is President Johnson, who will take over. And President Johnson gets more involved in Vietnam. In fact, he is a Democrat from Texas, which today seems very unlikely. So a Democrat in Texas is still pretty conservative. And as a result, he was supportive of that military-industrial complex. There were people who were talking in his ear, and he said, listen, I'll get you your war in there. I'll get you the supplies you need. Okay, just we have to convince Congress, we have to convince others that this is a thing, that we need to be involved. And so there's a huge, massive escalation during Johnson's presidency in Vietnam. Long story short, it's really not going well for the United States. Vietnam is not a declared war. Congress does not declare war in Vietnam. It's still a police action. But the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, one of the vocabulary words, they see the United States as invaders, as occupiers, And a lot of the capitalist Vietnamese also feel the same way. So they're not very happy about seeing us there either side. So things are not going very well. They can't tell who the enemy is. They're getting fired upon. They're getting attacked. It's just not going well at all. The United States does not make very many gains, and the United States has a draft, a military draft. We'll talk about that later. Also, just like we talked about the 1960 presidential election with the domestic affairs, we'll talk about the response to Vietnam on the home front later. But there's a draft. Soldiers are drafted to fight, but there's no actual war. It's not an official war, even though we call it the Vietnam War. It was really more of a police action. It was Congress didn't declare war. Johnson sees things aren't going well, but he's still continuing to fight for this war, to fight to prevent the spread of communism. By the time he leaves office in 1968, the war will still be raging, and President Nixon, who lost to Kennedy in 1960, Nixon will now inherit the war that is going disastrously. He will draw back U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Vietnamization, one of the vocabulary words, the United States should spend more time and effort training the Vietnamese to fight for themselves instead of us having to be there and our own people dying in order to support and hold up the government of the capitalist government of Vietnam. We'll talk more about Nixon and his demise again in the domestic affairs when we talk about Watergate later. But Nixon did go a long way to kind of thawing the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yeah. He is involved in negotiations with China. China is one of the main players in the spread of communism into Korea and into Vietnam. Any way they can get their foot in the door, basically. And one of the things they used was table tennis or ping pong. If you've seen Forrest Gump, now I doubt it was actually Forrest Gump who did it, but that was an inroad. Hey, let's put your best ping pong guy against our best ping pong people. And Nixon is the first president to go and visit China ever because of the results of this cooling down. And he was using China as a way to kind of soften up the Soviet Union. And maybe eventually the Soviet Union would be open to talking and negotiating because that Cuban Missile Crisis from a decade before was not something people wanted to relive. So they want to make sure they can kind of draw back that massive nuclear buildup. And the United States and Soviet Union will, under President Nixon, have what they call, one of the vocabulary words, I'm just going to throw it in there, détente. And this was to thaw it out. And the United States and Soviet Union, they produced a treaty called SALT I, and there'd be a SALT II later. This is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or in other words, they would put a limit to how many nuclear weapons they would be allowed to build so that no one got too big, too fast, and then threatened the world. Okay. And so that's really kind of this containment in a nutshell, the way the different presidents handled it with different degrees of success. So even though, for example, let's go back to Johnson, Johnson was not successful in executing a war in Vietnam. He was making up for that lack of popularity by doing very popular things in the United States with regard to civil rights, because as you know, this 1960s was huge civil rights decade in the United States. So he was large in passing and signing bills that would extend rights and that should have been granted or exercised all along, but signing bills to enforce laws to defend the rights of people who hadn't been receiving them for over a century. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of like the basic summary of those presidents and their how they handled the Cold War. All right, and whether we're building up or drawing down their involvement, it all depends on the president. Right. So does anybody have any questions? I don't see anyone putting any questions up in the chat over here. Anything going once? Going twice. All right, great. Well, thanks. I'm going to put this little quick video up on YouTube eventually, and it'll be there for everyone to see who may have missed our meeting today. All right, great. I'm going to stop.